Good evening, and thank you for joining me. One of the viewers, one of our subscribers, asked me if I would look at Nigel Farage, and I'm going to bite the bullet. However, it comes with an apology. First of all, it's apology for brevity. I'm skating over ice when I am doing it, and probably the keen ones amongst you will notice that when looking at the life of Nigel Farage, he's managed to, in his 60 years of life, he's managed to cram in an awful lot. So some areas I've skimmed over, some I've focused on in a little bit more, but I'm going to give you an overview on the life of Nigel Farage M.P. He was born in 1964. He's a baby boomer. Just baby boomers are born from 1945 to 1965, and he's just a baby boomer. He's 60 years of age. He's currently MP in the Houses of Parliament for the Clacton seat, and he's also leader of Reform UK from 2024. So he was both elected as an MP in the July 24 election, and he's also stepped in to be leader of the Reform UK party. Briefly, I'm going to go over this as briefly as I can. It's a bit like watching paint dry, and I'm going over sort of dates and things. From 2019 to 21, he was Brexit Party leader, and that's the party that became Reform. From 2006 to 2009, he was leader of the UKIP party, United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP. And then his longest tenure, if you like, as an elected politician was as an MEP, a member of the European Parliament. Some would argue that being an MEP is a bit of a toothless tiger type role. But from 1999 until 2020, when Britain withdrew from the EU in 2020, he was an MEP based in Brussels. He is a convinced Eurosceptic. I don't even almost have to say that, but he is very skeptical, not about Europe per se, but about the EU juggernaut, if you like, the European Union, the political, if you like, body of the EU. He's actually married a German, his second wife. So and his children speak fluent German, I believe. So he's not against Europe, he's against the EU. So he's a Eurosceptic. In 2014, UKIP in the European elections, UKIP won more seats than anybody else, than Labour or Tories. And this pushed David Cameron, the then Prime Minister of the UK, into a referendum later in 2016, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Farage has criticised the implementation and the delivery of Brexit. That is probably a leitmotif of Nigel Farage, is that he's engineered, one could argue, Brexit and the leaving of the EU, but he's also subsequently to our leaving the EU in 2020 argued very strongly that it hasn't been delivered. He's criticised the implementation and the delivery of Brexit, whether it's fisheries, whether it's farming policy, whether it's border integrity, which is almost non-existent. I'm speaking to you on I think it's the 12th of August. I think we've had 700 illegal immigrants cross from the Calais area over into Dover. The Labour government under Sir Keir Starmer is doing absolutely nothing, or virtually absolutely nothing. The Tory government under Rishi Sunak was doing pretty well, absolutely nothing about illegal immigration. So the Brexit election. I'll come back more in detail to that in a bit later. But Farage has criticised the implementation of Brexit from 2020. He is famously ridiculed by the mainstream media. In fact, there was a comedian called Joe Brand that when a milkshake was thrown over Nigel Farage, she famously suggested that milkshake was far too mild, and she suggested that battery acid would be a better bet. She wasn't sanctioned for that. She got away from, she was inciting violence, wasn't she? And it only needed somebody who was a little bit mentally unstable to go and buy some battery acid and to throw it over the man. And Joe Brand completely walked away. And this has been again a leitmotif in Nigel Farage's life, the if you like, the persecution of the mainstream media to him. Farage had a middle class upbringing. His dad was actually, amongst other things, he was a stockbroker. Farage was educated at the Dulwich College in Dulwich in London. It's a private school, and he was a conservative really from his school days, and he was evidenced, if you like, that charismatic personality very, very early on. In 1982, when he left school, he became a commodity broker in the City of London. Whilst he was a conservative, he did leave the Conservative Party in 1992. Those of you who can remember back that far, basically, the Conservative Party was taking a very pro-EU direction. Some of you will remember the Maastricht Treaty. And in 1993, he helped to found the UK Independence Party, UKIP, as it's known for short. Farage called out corruption when he was elected to the EU. He actually called out quite regularly the corruption within the EU, and the EU themselves, admitted that they did have a corruption problem as well as a democratic deficit. They were quite honest and open about admitting their deficiencies. And there was a very famous case, the Jacques Barrot case, where Farage called out some corruption there from that particular gentleman who was found against, and Farage was correct in that case. Farage called back in a while ago when the present King Charles III was the Prince of Wales. He gave a talk to the EU on climate change, and Farage famously said that the Prince of Wales at that time was both naive and foolish around climate change. And you could always argue that Farage has always been a skeptic with although he's an environmentalist, he would claim he's always been skeptical about net zero and about the climate crisis, as it's so often called. In 2014, was a high watermark for UKIP in the elections. They were the biggest single party from the UK. They were elected to the EU in that time. Just skipping back, actually, sorry to skip backwards and forwards, but in 2010, he was in a plane accident, and the pilot, he had some fairly serious injuries, did Farage. Subsequently, the pilot was, I suppose the best way of describing him was an odd character, and he died. The pilot died at his own hands in 2013, and the name of the pilot was a man called Justin Adams. But Farage was very, very fortunate to survive that accident. So forward on to 2014. Sorry about that. In that little connection there. But 2014, the EU elections, UKIP swept in on a landslide. And in May 2013, the UKIP got 23% of the UK local elections. So UKIP was rising in 2013, 2014. It was on the up, if you like. 2016 was a landmark year because David Cameron was basically forced into giving a referendum to the British people. He didn't particularly want to. And not only that, David Cameron famously came out for remaining in the EU. He pinned his colours to the mast, and it meant that if he lost, which he thought was highly unlikely, if he lost that referendum, he would have to resign. The powers that be, the institutions, the establishment, the elites, the mainstream media were all in favour of Remain. The Church of England was in favour of Remain via its bishops, via the Archbishop of Canterbury. Business leaders were trotted out, and there was all sorts of scare stories about what would happen to Britain if we actually left the EU. Anyway, June 2016 came along. 52% of the British population voted to leave. 48% voted to remain. David Cameron resigned, and Farage really was an engineer to bring about the leaving of the EU, which came later. So Farage sees the 24th of June 2016 as the British Independence Day. In the UK general election of 2019, Farage directed the Brexit Party to target Labour seats, and effectively he helped the Conservatives. He withdrew the Brexit Party from Tory-held seats. So he really helped Boris Johnson get that 80-seat majority in 2019. And again, I'm sorry I've skipped ahead very, very quickly. We're now in 2019. So Conservative landslide, the Labour Party were toast, and Boris Johnson won in 2019 with a very decent majority. But the Tories spurned his support, and Boris Johnson famously was very dismissive of Nigel Farage. Then, skipping forward a couple of years back, forward into 2021, he criticised the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, the RNLI, as a taxi service for illegal immigrants. And this perception of, if you like, he's an early adopter, if you like, of new things. He was the first one who really saw what was happening to illegal immigration via the Straits of Dover. He went out into fishing boats. He saw the handover between the French Coast Guard and the British Coast Guard and the so-called British Border Force. That's a farce, I think. Border Force, more like border farce. And he saw how illegal immigrants, and we're talking about illegal immigrants, were handed over, and the British government effectively colluded in the immigration of illegal immigrants, who were then housed in 4-star hotels, who were then given pocket money per week, who were then given right to remain. And many of these illegal immigrants were men between 17 years of age and 35 years of age. And arguably, they were economic migrants, many of them not genuine refugees. But that's a debate for another time. So he was an early adopter, if you like, of seeing things. And he saw in 2021 this illegal waterfall, if you like, of immigrants coming into the country. And Brexit Party in 2021 became Reform. And by then, Farage had withdrawn from Reform leadership, or Brexit Party, then became Reform. Farage had a lucrative GB News career, and he was very popular and very charismatic, because that's his nature. He's a charismatic man. But he felt he needed to help Reform. And in July 2024, I'm sure it's fresh in your mind, it's fresh in my mind, he decided to help Reform, became leader, worked with Richard Tice, who was the leader, who stepped aside for Nigel Farage. And in July 2024, at the general election, which was a snap election really, called by Rishi Sunak, 5 Reform MPs, including Farage, were elected. Interestingly, they won a greater percentage share of votes. Now, do correct me on this if I'm wrong. They won a greater percentage share of votes than the Liberal Democrat Party, the Lib Dems, who won more seats, considerably more seats. However, for Nigel Farage, the jinx had been broken. He became a British Member of Parliament for Clacton. And I think for him, although I haven't heard him speak about it, I suspect, and I'm guessing here, that it was probably a very pivotal, a very, if you like, a moment that he probably took some pride in, I suspect. Farage is a populist. He's right of centre. I would hesitate to call him a far right politician. He's right of centre. He's what the Conservative Party was, if you like, post-war in many senses. He's a populist, but he has charisma. If you compare Nigel Farage to Sir Keir Starmer, you'll picture Sir Keir Starmer here, and then you'll picture Nigel Farage there. He's a very different kettle of fish. Famously, Nigel Farage is friends with Donald Trump, and there was speculation that he'd become more involved in the November 2024 election, the US presidential election, which is now going to be between, I suspect it will be between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So he actually shot to stardom in the popular culture. He actually appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in 2023. And I think he came second, actually. But in the eyes of young people, he really got some profile through that. And that was to play into his hands in the 2024 election. So again, I'd just return to his EU credentials. He's avowedly anti-EU, and I've skated over some of the problems that he faced as a Euro MP. He stayed the course, and he left only in 2020 when we actually formally left the EU. I think it was June 2020. I think we left the EU formally. Some highlights, if you like, of Nigel Farage's life. He was barred from his Coutts account, Coutts the bank, which is owned by Nat West. And cut a long story very short, he basically won that battle because they were trying to blackball him. They were trying to bar him, cancel him. And in 2023, he got an apology both from Nat West and from Coutts. And if I'm correct, I may be not correct in this, but I believe the chairman of Nat West and the chairman of Coutts actually stepped down. So arguably, I'm using that word arguably a lot, aren't I? But he's actually got a lot to give. And I suspect he'll be a thorn in the side of the Sir Keir Starmer government, the Labour government. I suspect as well, depending on the leader who is elected for the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party is now a shadow of its former self. I suspect he might be a thorn in the side of the Conservative Party. I think it's only fair to highlight this particular fact. He has been a whipping boy for the mainstream media. I mentioned Joe Brand, who said it would be a good idea to throw battery acid over him rather than a milkshake. And again, this is redolence of the sort of style of the mainstream media, comedians, bishops in the Church of England, all very dismissive of him. The Conservative Party, all very dismissive of him. So he's been a whipping boy for the, if you like, the establishment, the elites, if you like. I call them the London elites. Some people call them the London metropolitan elites. The BBC stands out as a particular tormentor, if you like, for Nigel Farage, rather than giving him the same platform, if you like, as any other politician. they have demonized him in many cases, and they've not been partial. They've not been impartial. They've been very partial, particularly the BBC. He stood foursquare behind any move to defend national sovereignty. I think you can't fault his consistency on national sovereignty, and I think where the Tories have become wet and liberal, Farage has stayed the course. He's defended national sovereignty. He's a strong believer in immigration controls being effective. So Rishi Sunak, if you remember, in 2022, was talking about we'll stop the boats, then the Rwanda scheme. But instead of actually pushing through energetically with force, Rishi Sunak was a wet blanket. However, Nigel Farage, you can't call him a wet blanket on immigration. So as reform leader, he's added charisma, he's added energy, he's added drive and direction to a very under Richard Tice. I think Richard would admit he was probably struggling a bit. Richard Tice put a lot of his own money and a lot of his own resources into reform, but it needed that zip, it needed that zest to get the party off the ground, if you like, airborne. And I think Nigel Farage has done that with reform. Where it goes in 2025 and beyond, who knows? You know, your comments are welcome. But he adds that charisma, he adds that energy. You know, you'll often see him in a pub having a pint. You know, unfashionably, he's still a smoker, I believe. He's given it drive. The Reform Party, he's given it drive, direction to really what was quite a moribund party that probably wouldn't have won any MPs. Reform has now 5 MPs, including, of course, Farage himself. So I would argue that Nigel Farage has, and Reform, have it all to play for now. Interested in your comments. Again, do like and subscribe. Give me a thumbs up if you like. I just wanted to say I have skated over very, very quickly. I'm still 21 minutes in, and I've hardly covered a lot of things. So you know, I'm ever so sorry. I have left out a lot. But if you like it, subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and I hope I've done justice to the legendary Nigel Farage M.P.